Okay, team. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Momentum Webinar Advanced Series, last webinar happening right now called Actions and Tactics. We're very excited to have you all here on the call. So, team, let's get started. As many of you know, and we're doing this recap in every last advanced webinar, so you know what we're talking about. But we already had an initial or a basic webinar series that talked about this introduction to the two traditions of organizing, which we're calling momentum and structure. And then our claiming is that we should do both combined, which creates a hybrid model, right? Then we also talked about in our second webinar, well, what would that integration look like? What is our understanding of that integration? And then we talked about best practices and hybrid models. We talked about, well, who's doing the best integration, because we didn't invent this. So there are other people already doing this. And in the last webinar, we talked about common problems. Now, we had a lot of people come and join us on the webinars. Many of you know we're having a training coming up very soon. And now in this webinar advanced series, this is our last one. We did in the first one, we talked about how to frame the movement successfully, meaning how to frame the movement towards victory so that it feels like we're advancing and we can engage more people and create more momentum. In the webinar last week, we talked about team structures or decentralized team structures and mass training and all those things. Pretty cool. If you should see it, just check it. And the last one for today is actions and tactics. So we're going to talk about that. I also wanted to say that if you're watching this webinar for the first time and you have not seen our first initial webinar series, you should definitely watch webinar 1 to make sure that you understand some of the concepts that we're going to repeat. Actually, I will recommend that you watch the whole series to understand even more, but you probably only need the first webinar to really at least grab some of the basic concepts, maybe the first and the second. Okay, so let's get started. So we want to get first this understanding ready, because, you know, as many of you know, I've been part of the mechanism movement for some time now, and there's we want to make an equation that it says, well, not an equation, but we want to make a distinction that says, look, good actions equal good polarization. So anytime you think about, well, is this a good action? Is this a good thing we're doing? We really want you to think, well, am I actually polarizing? So let's talk about that. So we talked before, team, about the cycle of momentum, right? That starts with a strong movement organization doing kind of a big nonviolent action for a popular demand, right? You can either do small actions that maybe create trigger events, or that create those big moments of participation that we call the moments of the whirlwind, right? If you do that right, so if an action does good polarization, so if a good action does good polarization, then that creates popular support for the movement, and then that gets absorbed into the movement organization so you can do more escalation again and again, right? Basic cycle. So I want us to make sure to know that we are going to focus right now on this last part of the cycle. Let me see, where's my mouse? Right here. This part right here is where we're going to focus, right? What goes from here and what creates good polarization, which is to make this happen, right? Because if this doesn't happen, then we don't go through the cycle and we, you know, fail miserably. Okay, let's continue. So that was the cycle of momentum. Now, we said in our first webinar that there's two measurements of success, because it's hard sometimes to understand, well, what does victory really look like? And we want to go back to that, right? We said that for the movement to understand success, it has to measure two things. The first one is polarization, which is how much is the public supporting us, so how much public support are we getting, right? And then the other one is organizational development. How much people are participating in the movement, or how is the capacity of the movement increasing? So I want to go back, right? We set the cycle, and this is the two measurements of the cycle to say, was the cycle successful? When we went through the cycle, was the cycle successful, which is the way that we measure the success of the movement. And the last piece of this, because we're talking about public support, right, and why we're equating this, is that pretty much we're trying to move people that are, as many of you know, as we already discussed in webinar 2, from the opposition, or from this part, maybe from the passive opponents to the neutrals, to the movement side. We want to make them more active. We want to make them more part of the movement, okay? So how do we do that? We do that by this process of polarization, which pretty much polarization, you can say that you're making people choose sides. You're allowing people to say, am I with the movement or am I against the movement? That's essentially the question that through your action, through your movement, you're posting and getting as many people to come in. But that's pretty much the basic understanding of the spectrum, right? So good polarization is what creates good popular support. And to have good polarization, we need good actions. Okay? So what does polarization mean? Let's talk about it one more time. It really move in the middle, right, towards us. It also means moving all the passive support to be active and moving people really into the movement, which is what I was sharing, right? And also up the ladder. And what does up the ladder means? We talked about in our last couple of webinars about the ladder of engagement, about how do you get people to participate with higher levels of commitment. So it's also about getting more people to have more amounts of higher commitment. Okay, so good action equals good polarization. Now, Paul, you want to take over this one?
Yes. So I have been consulting many organizations about doing big protests or civil disobedience, and a lot of mainstream organizations like Move On or the labor movement like Unite Here, and I've talked to them, and there's a lot of fear about escalating. There's a lot of things that they're scared will go wrong. But when they see polarization, they think like, holy crap, is the public going to like what we do? And is there a possibility that if we take over a street or we do civil disobedience or somebody does something like a hunger strike, they're going to think we're crazy because we're so much more committed, doing high-risk stuff, doing stuff that's very dramatic the public can't relate to, and they're scared that their members might be isolated from the movement. And that is what we call bad triangulation, right? Bad polarization. We want to move the public towards us, and what Carlos was just saying is that means moving everyone where they're at towards us, but we're going to lose some people are going to choose to move against us. The question that we need to ask is, how do we know whether or not the public is going to choose our side or the opposition? And we need to make sure that we can get the majority of the people to move in our direction, and we need to make sure that we're moving every level on the spectrum of support to our side. We need to engage our base to move them to the side. This is different than triangulation. Polarization is the exact opposite of triangulation. What triangulation was is a political philosophy that the Clinton administration used, which is basically trying to move the passive middle, trying to get a very moderate passive support to a super majority of the American population, okay? But it wasn't really moving that many people that far towards our side. Instead, it was trying to water down the message. What we're trying to do is move everyone as far to our side as possible and to engage our base. And the way we can predict that, and we know if we can get good polarization, and you can become a wizard at this because a lot of organizations are scared to do this, and they say, how do we know it's going to be good polarization? And if you know the secrets, you can predict how polarization is going to happen. And this being able to predict this has allowed me to do a lot of different actions and to advise people correctly when we didn't know whether or not to escalate an issue. Because a lot of times in the labor movement, in the environmental movement, in the climate justice movement, you're going to have issues that are defensive issues. You've got to choose whether or not, like in Wisconsin, do we escalate this fight around collective bargaining rights that happened 3 years ago, or do we sit this one out or do another issue? And I can predict whether or not escalation is going to move the public towards us. How do I do that? Well, a lot of that has to do with the theory of civil resistance and nonviolence. There's a lot of discussion about what makes the population polarized towards us. And we're going to summarize it within the 5 factors of polarization. And if you know this, you can create actions that you know are going to create good polarization instead of bad polarization. And you're going to also be able to predict when escalation or types of actions are going to really hurt your movement. They're going to polarize towards the opposition using the 5 factors. So the first major concept of the factors of polarization is the demand or the framing of the goal. Cesar Chavez said it this way: but we have another kind of power, the power that comes from a just cause. He was saying this: we don't have the power of money, we don't have the power of status, like a lot of the politicians. We have the power of a just cause. And what this concept is, if you want to predict whether or not somebody's going to choose your side, the biggest factor by far is whether or not the public empathizes or supports your cause, the cause of the goal of the movement or the demand of the action specifically. And if you know how the public sees that and whether or not they support you, and this is just logical, okay? Like in a fight, if you see two people fighting, you're naturally going to side with the person that you believe is representing the cause that you believe in. And that's the same thing in the media. It's the same thing about a politician. You are going to side with the politician that represents the goals and the demands that you believe in your life. So in a movement, people associate with the movement first and foremost based on the cause. Whether it's Occupy Wall Street, right? They see Occupy Wall Street based on its goals of ending inequality, fighting for the rights of the 99%. First and foremost, people are going to relate to the movement based on how they relate to the goal and the demand of the movement.
And for example, this is one example, right, Brother Paul, about a good public demand or good popular demand. And this is a polling that came out in February 2011 around the DREAM Act and where Latinos were in the DREAM Act. And actually, this polling was just really right before the president was pushed to this large deferred action, and it really puts out that 91% of Latinos favor the DREAM Act. It's just a percentage saying they favor a law that let unauthorized immigrant children become legal residents if they go to college or serve the military for 2 years. So this is a good way that this is an issue that is well framed. You can say it's a good popular demand, that it's clear to the public. Most Latinos it's very hard for them to say that they do not support their children, or the children of their nieces and nephews to go to school and have same opportunities.
And I want to say this: polling allows you to see how, before the action happens, whether or not they support your cause, your demand, or your goal. And it's the biggest predictor about whether or not they're going to polarize to your side. But it's not just polling whether or not the general public supports your cause, but how deeply they support your cause. And Frank Luntz, who is a famous Republican strategist, devised this way of polling that since many other public relations people on the left, like Ryan Clayton, who's a friend of mine, they actually use this different type of polling. And what this polling does is you're not just measuring whether or not somebody supports your cause, it measures how much they support your cause, and it measures the middle, it measures your base in your movement, and it measures the opposition. So, and sometimes this is called micro-polling. There's a lot of different terminology for this, but we're not just talking about public opinion polls that say whether or not they support the cause, but whether or not how deeply the support is from different people on the spectrum of support.
Thank you.
And this is important.
You want to talk about like an unpopular demand?
Yes. So there's a lot of very unpopular demands, like even the anti-war movement in the beginning of right after Bush launched into the war, the people were attacking the anti-war movement, the peace movement, because they felt it was unpatriotic and stuff. In cases like that, a lot of times what the movement can do is or a lot of times police brutality is not a particularly popular issue among a large portion of the public. Really supports the police or fire department and stuff. There's a lot of there are many different issues that ending the military industrial complex, like ending military spending. That is, the public really likes to spend money on the military. I don't know exactly all the reasons why, but so there's a lot of issues that the left has that aren't really that popular. But a lot of times, what you can do, even on like military expenditures, is you can pick specific things that the military spends money on that the public might not sympathize with. Or you can pick issues, sub-issues, like in the anti-war movement when it wasn't popular. Cindy Sheehan, who is this, and I'm going to talk to her a little bit later, but she was this grieving mother who made this demand that she wanted the president to be honest and to explain the real reasons why her son was sent to war and died. And she demanded a meeting to get that information with the president. And the public really sympathized with transparency, and it sympathized with the demand to give a grieving mother a meeting with the president. So if you polled based on that, everyone agreed with her, even if they were against the war. So a lot of times you can take very unpopular goals and you could break them up into demands that are more popular.
Thank you. So Paul, let's talk about the second piece, and I'll go explain the spectrum, and I would love your thoughts on this as well. So team, the second factor is levels of sacrifice and disruption. And to me, I want to say that when Paul was sharing this information with me, I got really, really excited, because this really made sense to me about why certain actions creating more momentum or more polarization than others, right? So let's go through it. The first thing I think to understand, and it's this quote by Gandhi that says, with an endless capacity to suffer, victory is inevitable. And sometimes when I read this quote when I was much younger, I thought, well, maybe Gandhi's just being idealistic about victory. You know, he's just probably trying to tell that to his people so they can get motivated or whatever, you know. But what I really didn't understand is that actually Gandhi thought about this as a science, because actually what he says in this capacity to suffer is that that's really that every time that the movement sacrifices, more people join the movement. And if more people join the movement and do more sacrifice, then eventually you get more participation. If you get more participation, eventually you win. So actually this quote is quite accurate. And it's not so moralistic, it's more scientific. But let's explain actually the spectrum of those two things so they can make sense. So as you can see, on this axis right here, right, you have the sacrifice axis going from right to left, from low to high sacrifice, and then we have the other axis from low disruption to high disruption, from bottom up, right? And we're going to go through each quadrant to really explain it, and then we're going to go back to the whole thing and debrief this with Paul as well. So if we look at the kind of like this bottom right side, we can see in the low sacrifice, low disruption phase, for example, something like signing a petition, right, is something that really doesn't involve a lot of sacrifice from people, or doing a letter writing campaign, or doing a protest. It's not that much. But also in this spectrum, in the low disruption spectrum, it also doesn't cost that much disruption, right? Not as much as, for example, an occupation of a public space will, right? You see that already starts increasing, right? Or blockading a public building. So you see here that the scale starts going up, right? And also here, the sacrifice, you can see that maybe you start with a petition, but then you start moving to protest, to mass march. You start doing things that involve more of your commitment. So that's the quadrant. Let's go a little bit to the bottom left quadrant, right? So now we're talking about high sacrifice by low disruption. So let's talk about just the high sacrifice one, because we're already talking about low disruption, right? For example, risk and arrest is seen as much more sacrificial. Now you're putting your body on the line. You've been spending maybe a day in jail. Maybe if you spend 2-3 days in jail, a week in jail, it might but be more, right? You can also do a hunger strike. But for example, a lot of people lately this year in 2014, there's been a lot of groups in the immigrant movement that have been doing hunger strikes. And sometimes the notion is, well, why isn't that polarizing? Well, why isn't that creating momentum? It's because that action has been repeated so many times that people do not even believe it that it's sacrificial. So they're just like not disengaged, right? But if, for example, if somebody would have done a hunger strike until death, which is this one right here, the H as until death, it would have really changed the dynamics, because people would be like, oh my God, there's people that really care about this cause. We really got to pay attention, right? Or also there were hunger strikes that were happening in detention centers, and they were getting a lot of attention, right? Certain large amount of inmates in the Washington detention center were doing hunger strikes, right? And also just here in the high sacrifice realm, also we have self-immolation, which is what many people in the east of the world have done, which is they pour themselves on fire as an act of of civil resistance to dramatize supporting their cause, which is a big deal. It has happened in a lot of the Arab countries, like in Tunisia and others. But really create this. Some people even credit that these moments were the ones that created this kind of like the pretty much Arab Spring and everything that emerged around that. So this is in the high sacrifice. Last spectrum, and really this is the world where we want to live in, which is high disruption and high sacrifice. And we also want to let you know that this has to be built little by little bit. We want to make sure you don't think that we can go high sacrifice, high disruption at once, because it really doesn't work that way. But for example, in high disruption, you can really see, build occupation of a building or doing a strike, or really stopping the transit at a city. Like if here in my city of Boston, you stop the MBTA, which is our local transportation system, people will go nuts because we really use it, right? So you will do huge amounts of disruption. You can really stop the city. You can also take over a freeway during rush hour, which Paul can tell you this in Los Angeles. I mean, you will get traffic with nobody taking over anything. But if activists actually took over a couple of highways, the city will be stopped. And if you have hundreds of people doing it and getting arrested at the same time, it will be stopped, right? You will have high amount of disruption, right? So think about that and how that combines. So those are the axes. But Paul, let's go back to the whole thing and explain a little bit more to us about this dynamic.
So this is what I want to say, is that high sacrifice and low sacrifice, that high sacrifice in civil resistance in the Gandhian school of nonviolence, he talks about the concept of sacrifice being one of the most important concepts, that when people make deep sacrifices and they suffer in lots of different ways, physically, or they get thrown in jail, they get beaten up, that it creates a public backlash. And we know in science a lot of the reason why that is what I call mom power, is that people naturally empathize with people that they see. So in the civil rights movement, there was a lot of people that were getting killed for doing things like registering to vote. But it wasn't until people were getting beaten up by the cops in the media spotlight, when people were dying through getting beaten up in ways that publicized it to the world, and then people related to it. If I go to jail, my mom instantly becomes an activist for the cause, because she starts calling everybody and my friends, is he going to get out? When is this going to happen? And she starts getting invested in the cause, even if for her it wasn't a real reality, like an issue I was fighting for, immigrant rights or getting money out of politics. When I'm invested in suffering so much because she cares about me, she all of a sudden now cares about the cause. This mom power, this power of empathy, is the cornerstone of what we need to do. And Martin Luther King called it creating a moral crisis. That through our sacrifice, we force people to choose a side, and we elevate it in the media. And in the media, they call this what leads bleeds, or what bleeds leads in the media, okay? That cameras and pictures, people want to relate, and they feel emotionally connected to pain, to suffering. And so the higher levels of sacrifice you do, or if it's a lot of people sacrificing a little, it creates a pull from the public that they empathize with it and they relate to it. Another way of talking about this is, even if somebody's marching or participating in a movement, inherently everyone they know sympathizes with them. And it's an immigrant rights movement. 1.2 million people marched in Los Angeles. That's a huge portion of the entire Latino population. And they did polling to figure out whether or not people changed their views. And people who had family members or somebody they knew, which was a majority of the LA population, had somebody they knew that was in the march, they changed their values much deeper than other people who didn't feel connected to it. Another way to talk about this, Gandhi talks about it as what we sacrifice for, and even the country sacrifices for, we elevate as our values or priority. Just like a religious person will make sacrifices to their God, or they'll make sacrifices to the values that they care about, all of a sudden those things become elevated in their lives. They've elevated that over the things that they sacrifice. So in our country, the concept of people being martyred or killed for our country allows us to value our country more. Okay, whether or not you agree or disagree with that, that is a basic concept of sacrificial action. And in early Christian thought, and even in the Old Testament, this is talked about a lot. In the early church, it was talked about as the blood of the martyrs is the seeds of the church, that the sacrifices of early Christians that were killed in the Roman Empire actually created tons of public sympathetic support in the movement. But high disruption is exactly the opposite. If you disrupt people's lives, a lot of times they're not going to empathize with you. For instance, there was the public transit protest where the New York public transit workers were fighting for their pension and stuff, and they went on strike, which for them was pretty easy. It didn't require that much sacrifice for them, but it created major disruption of everyone in New York who couldn't ride the subway. So people hated them because of that. They hated the cause. So the first factor of whether or not somebody sympathizes with you is the demand and the cause. But if you have high levels of disruption, it isolates people from you. It makes them choose the opposite side because they don't want to be disrupted or negatively affected. But sacrifice allows them to sympathize with you. If you have a general strike, like in Los Angeles during the immigrant rights movement in 2006, we had a general strike that shut down fast food joints and hotels and even the major city streets all across the city. But the polling around the demand was so supportive. 90% of like LA population was so supportive that people didn't care about the disruption anymore. And so it just polarized people to our side. But it's hard to do that unless you have high levels of sacrifice and also you have good support in the public.
Thank you, Paul. And Paul, I think just to add this, what you're saying as well is that we have to have high levels of sacrifice and have a lot of public support before we do a lot of high disruption, before we go crazy. So let's talk about the third factor. So team, the third factor is sympathetic and unsympathetic people that participate or that are targeted within the struggle. So for example, let's talk first on the sympathetic side, right? For example, Rosa Parks, very sympathetic individual in the Montgomery community in the 1950s when the Montgomery bus boycott started, right? And as many of you know, I think, or some of you know, in the campaign about 2 weeks before Rosa Parks got arrested, there was another young woman that was probably 16 years old that got arrested because she also refused to give up her seat. She was kind of like the first one that gave up her seat in that campaign. And it really did not really cause an uproar of the community as Rosa Parks did because of, well, one, she was very highly respected in the community. Two, she was a secretary of the NAACP at that time and for many years. So they really gave an uproar for people to kind of uprise to that. So really the participation of highly sympathetic people make a big deal on the polarization, right, of the issue. Another one, for example, here's retired Philly police captain Ray Lewis that said, "I will not idle stand while the law enforcement is administered only to the poor and disenfranchised, while the rich flaunt their immunity." And I think this is so cool because I think when people see this image on the media, they think about, well, you know what, activists are just a bunch of hippies or whatever, they're just dirty people. That's probably how they think, the majority of people, right, about activists. But when they see a police officer or when they see a law enforcement person getting arrested for the cause, it really changes people's perspectives of the law, and people then support the cause much more, right, because a lot of people still believe in cops, you know. Another one, for example, Storm Morello, right, that got arrested in solidarity with other hotel workers in Los Angeles a couple of years ago. You know, so, and this is a big deal, right, because then he tells people, well, if he's doing it, it must be a right cause, you know. Maybe it's not just all these immigrant workers, maybe it gives more, right? So highly sympathetic people. But also on the other side, you can also have highly unsympathetic people that you're targeting against. For example, for Occupy, it was Wall Street. Right? People hated Wall Street. I mean, we still do in some ways, you know? And for example, in the immigrants movement, it's been Sheriff Joe Arpaio, which we know he's super duper racist. You know, he's on all kinds of human rights abuses. But he has really become, you know, people might say, well, I don't know if I want to go out in a march for, you know, forget rights for undocumented certain people, right? But no, but if it's about beating our pie, I'll go any day. So there's a lot of that stuff going on, you know, because there's animosity to these people as well. So that's the third factor, which is highly sympathetic or unsympathetic people that you target. Paul, you want to talk about public relations?
Well, I just want to say this, that when I talked about mom power, there's a lot of psychological studies about how people have what's called mirror neurons, in which they naturally empathize when they witness suffering. They will naturally feel empathy for that person without them even really choosing to do so. One of the major factors about whether or not somebody can empathize is whether or not they think that that person is part of themselves, that that person is an other. If they can other that person and make that person feel like they're the enemy or whatever, then their mind shuts off their natural capacity to empathize. And so Fox News knows this very well. Whenever there is a protest, they want to discredit the people, okay, who are doing the protest. They want to call them commies. They want to say, oh, they're just hippies, they're commies, they're terrorists. And in that way, it stops that natural empathy. But if you have policemen getting arrested, if you have Cindy Sheehan, who's a grieving military mom who lost a son, that's something that that constituency can empathize with. Or in the environmental movement, instead of just environmentalists who are stopping trees being cut, loggers also participating in these small towns. This dramatically changes people's capacity to empathize with the protests. So this is another major factor. It's not the most important one. The most important one is demand. The second one is disruption and sacrifice. But the third one, about whether or not they choose your side, is whether or not they have sympathetic people who are the heroes and unsympathetic people for the enemies.
Okay. Perfect.
So the fourth major factor, and these are in order of importance, so the fourth one is what we call public relations capacity. And public relations is a whole field of thought, and there's a lot of knowledge. There's whole college, university departments that talk about public relations. And what public relations is really talking about is how, as a movement or an organization, how we can, through our energy and our relationships and how we frame things, how we can actually change the way the media and the press relates to us, and how we can also distribute our messages. And one of the biggest things to talk about is called framing, which is we can choose how we present our movement and how we present the actions we do. So we can choose how to do that. And do we use the language of our movement, or do we use the language of just our movement or the left, or do we use the language that people understand? And there was a lot of cognitive theorists. The biggest and most famous is this guy named George Lakoff, and there's been a series of other cognitive scientists that have studied basically that people have frames of how they think about every popular issue in the United States of America politically, and how they think about the movement, how they think about Wall Street, how they think about basically everything. And so these cognitive scientists have figured out what language people use and the frames, the cognitive frames that they use and the metaphors they use to explain everything. You can use that language and you're speaking the language of the public. And so how you frame things dramatically changes things. I'll give you an example. In the healthcare fight, there was this whole debate around single payer. I was in a coalition that wanted to fight for single payer, okay? And there was framing the issue as the movement for single payer. Well, first thing, what the hell is single payer? No one knows what single payer is. Single payer is a sort of like a public insurance plan that's run by the government that everyone has access to, okay? Single payer is the Canadian program, okay? I had to explain all that. Most people in the American public didn't know how to relate to it. So we framed it as Medicare for all. Well, everyone understands Medicare because Medicare is one of the most popular programs. It's the same concept, but we framed it in a different way. And the second thing is that in the framing is that when we said even Medicare for all, it was very hard to get media around that because people were only thinking what is possible is between public option, having a public option, or not. Okay, so the whole political fight was framed within that, and people didn't understand where we were coming from because we weren't in the public debate. So good framing means you're using the language that allows people to sympathize with you and to take a stand with you, and so that they can understand it and they can feel you're important within the public debate. The second thing, B, is the relationship with the media. And there's a lot of ways to create a relationship with the media, but if you have a public relations department, you need to cultivate lots of different personal relationships, lots of different institutional relationships where you can call, you can give press releases, that you can find ways in which people in the press can write stories about you. And a lot of that has to do with whether or not you can communicate to them. And I've seen time and time again, when I was even just a high school activist and I was doing protest in high school, one of the reasons why we got so much attention is because I had a personal relationship with somebody at the local newspaper. And she would call me every month. I would go out to coffee with her, and she would call me and ask me, "Oh, what are you doing in the next 3 months? Like, can I cover a protest?" And so I would feed ideas about different protests that were happening. And sometimes, because of that, she'd get really interested, and she would pitch the story to the editorial board at the Register, which is the largest paper in Iowa. So I did these high school protests that got front page of the biggest newspaper in Iowa, almost solely because I had a great relationship with this reporter. So it doesn't always have an impact, but these public relation factors sometimes have big impacts. And the last one is the capacity to create and distribute your own media. Okay, so a lot of times stories gain a lot more publicity when you have writers who are independent writers or lefty writers are already creating a buzz, or there's a YouTube video that goes viral. We just did this action where there was a disruption at the Supreme Court. We had our own YouTube video that was framed in our way, and it went viral, and that helped create a legitimacy in the story. It helped get out the story so that the mainstream media wanted to cover it. But there's so many cases of that in Occupy Wall Street. We're going to go over a couple of them where there was repression or there was something that was dramatic and the mainstream media didn't care, but because we were able to distribute and share our stories, it really exploded. So, this is what I want to say. Public relations, if you don't have all those other things set up, if you don't have the demand set up, if your action isn't designed right, if you don't have good sympathetic people, heroes and enemies, public relations people, and they'll tell you this, if you hire a professional public relations person that has great capacity, they can't do much. They can only do, it's like they're given a theater, they're given a whole story, and they can tweak it and frame it right and give it to the media and distribute it themselves, but if they don't have a good story, it's very hard for them to do much of anything. So, but it is still important, and there is examples of having a great story, but not having the public relations capacity to do much of anything with it.
Let's do the last one then, Paul, and then we'll take a quick stop.
The fifth one, and I got this from Gene Sharp, is when there's a lot of little factors that it's very hard to like measure, you just lump them together and call them intangible. So this is the fifth factor is intangible, and it's all the little things that sometimes just very rarely make a difference. And I think the biggest one is that a lot of times when you're creating the story with the demand, you're creating the whole, it's like improv theater. You're creating and setting up the action and the movement, and and all the players, and you're creating an action scenario where there's lots of sacrifice or disruption, and you're creating the right people to present that to the press and to the media. But sometimes little things happen that change the whole thing. And a lot of times that's like in action scenarios, like if the press gets arrested or beat up, sometimes they become really adamantly invested in the story. Or sometimes you have a lot of credibility because of an action that you just did, or something just happened that, like a news hook or something that made this part of framing, but something happens that all of a sudden makes your action relevant. You get the right buzz at the right time. The example I have about this is in the Hotel Workers Union, they did this video which they sent to all the people interested in coming to LA to do a convention. And the convention industry is, tens of millions of dollars are spent every year in the convention industry. And they sent out this video called The City on the Edge, which was basically talking about how there's all this poverty and violence in Los Angeles, and that it affects people who want to come to conventions. So it was kind of like telling people, you shouldn't come to LA unless you want to support solutions to poverty, unless you want to support minimum wage, okay? And it said that the city is on the edge, and that there's a lot of violence and there's a lot of racial tension. And they sent it out literally 1 month before the riots broke out. So the video, they sent it out, and then the riots hit. So it looked prophetic, the video. So all of a sudden, this video became front page LA Times, and it got into the New York Times. It became this huge story about this video to the convention industry, and no one would have ever expected that. That was an intangible factor.
Thank you, Paul. So team, let's do a quick review. Thank you so much, Paul, about this. So let's the 5 factors. Good demand, framing of the goal, and Paul said that if we don't get this one right, it's going to be difficult. Then the amount of sacrifice, disruption, and scale of the actions that we do make a huge difference. Then we thought about what the participation of sympathetic people or unsympathetic people, or either people that the public cares about or enemies chosen, make a big deal. And the last two that Paul talked about was public relations capacity and intangible factors, which is just hard. So Belinda, if you can come back and join us, we just wanted to do a quick 5 minutes if there are any thoughts, questions, and comments on the good actions or good polarization, and also on the 5 factors before we go to the last part of the webinar.
Great. So hi folks. So we're going to take some questions now. We know we just downloaded a lot of complicated information into your brain, and we want to know if you have any questions, if there were any things that you found really, really useful about the 5 factors of polarization, or if there's anything that's unclear to you that you want to ask about. The light looks super cool at your house, Paul.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it looks really cool. It's like super blue and glowy.
Like a dungeon?
No, it was like crazy white light or blue. It was really cool.
You're doing good. You're doing good. Belinda, do we have any comments, or should we continue?
Not yet,
well,
but
I want Mimi to ask if she has any questions or comments. Is there anything in particular you think was clear? Either I want what you resonated with, what you thought was good, or clear or unclear.
This is the feedback.
Yes.
Oh,
it is.
Hello.
What resonated a lot, but maybe also because we worked on it a bunch. Some of the examples was the parts I think was really good. The high disruption examples about the New York subway. Yeah, I think what maybe and I only realize this now, that what could be maybe confusing, or maybe would need some more clarifying, is the acts on the high disruption and low disruption. I think it was something maybe that had come up also a while ago, but and I'm not really clear on how that can be improved, but I think that maybe there would be a lot of follow-up questions.
It's confusing. What's confusing
maybe
about it?
Because you're not sure. Because, for example, the high disruption, when you go into like the top left corner, for example, the high disruption and high sacrifice. You want high sacrifice, but you don't want too much of the disruption, like on the freeway, for example, because it just clashes too much with the public's interest. So I think sometimes if someone's looking at that corner and trying to understand, well, where is my action successful in terms of high sacrifice and of high disruption, but and this is where the polling comes in to play. I think it can be, I don't know if there's a better, infographic or visual way of kind of representing how that isn't always necessarily the best combination. I don't know, it was great.
I think her point is really a good one, which is that people get confused because in some ways we're saying we really believe in high disruption, high sacrifice, but there is some weaknesses to that. So maybe talking about it as strengths and weaknesses of high sacrifice in the third part of this webinar, we're going to sort of go over. But it's kind of hard to represent that because it seems conflicting messages.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Mimi.
Yeah, thanks.
That was great feedback. And does anyone else on the line have comments? Things that were really interesting or things that were unclear about the 5 factors? We'll wait until Paul comes back. And then if we don't get any questions before then, we'll just continue.
We look a little tired today, don't we?
A little bit.
I think we need more juice.
Or more sleep.
Cheers to everybody.
Cheers. Got my tea.
Got my aguardiente.
Oh yeah.
It's the only way to do webinars.
You're crazy, bro.
I'm sure. I hope we cut this part for the blooper section.
Sorry.
No, this will just be on YouTube.
This will be in YouTube, yeah. It's fine.
Okay, cool. So we haven't gotten any more questions or comments, so I think we can go ahead and continue.
Okay. So, team, this part is much shorter, and I think, Paul, I think we should really take the time to explain both the repression piece and then also the access again, so that we can be on the same page. So, rock and roll with repression.
So what I want to talk about is, and this is a very important concept, because a lot of times people are really scared that they're going to get beat up by the cops or people are going to go to jail. There's going to be a lot of repression. And a lot of people are scared of the risk of doing high disruptive and high sacrificial actions because it can cause repression from the police, especially in places where there's dictatorships, where people can be killed. And that is true. There are some legitimate fears in that. But there's also something that in civil resistance literature, in the field of civil resistance, and in Gandhian nonviolence, this has been a term that has been really developed over time. This theorist called Richard Gregg in the 50s and the 60s talked about this concept. He called it political jujitsu, which is if you frame everything right, if you set up the 5 factors in the right way, and the police repress you, it actually creates a moral and political backlash, okay? And the metaphor that's used is jujitsu. Jujitsu is a martial art. Some people say Aikido is a better metaphor, but both of them are similar martial arts that basically take the energy of your opponent and uses it against them. So the harder they punch you, try to punch you, the more energy you're able to use their energy to flip them, or to get them to trip, or to get their joints pulled out. So the more they try to punch you, the harder they punch, the harder the energy that gets redirected back at them. Well, Gandhi saw this as a science. He's like, if you have a moral cause, and you're sacrificing a lot, and you're prepared for it. If your organization and the public supports you, and then the police hurt you or kill you or beat you, there's going to be a public backlash. And Gandhi believed that it's a science of the exact energy that they put into repressing you, in creating sacrifice, is the energy that will be created, and he calls this soul force, that's created in exact proportion of the repression. And you can kind of see that also affects disruption and sacrifice, that when the police repress you, that it creates higher levels of sacrifice and generally higher levels of disruption. If they fire tear gas into the crowd, or they're doing something, it creates more disruption, and it creates more people that are sympathizing with you. And there's even sociological studies about this, about how if somebody sees in a fight somebody conduct themselves in a very peaceful and moral way, even if they don't know why the fight's breaking out, that they'll inherently sympathize with the person who is considered to be the victim of the aggression. And if they see somebody, because inherently we root for the underdog, and we sympathize with somebody being brutally beat up, especially if they're nonviolent and if they're not retaliating. We sympathize with that person, and we think it's unjust. We think violence and repression is inherently unjust. If those other factors, if we sympathize with the person being engaged. So this concept is called political jiu-jitsu. It's one of the quintessential factors for nonviolence, and it's, if you talk about, and we're going to talk about this, whirlwinds that happen in trigger events, a lot of times trigger events and whirlwinds are created through political jiu-jitsu, high levels of disruption and high levels of sacrifice. If you look at Birmingham, for instance, this is a historic, iconic picture of fire hoses being turned on non-violent protesters that are not fighting back. Police dogs biting black protesters in the South. And some people said that these shots really changed all the public opinion around civil rights movement in a way that could not be replicated by any form of advertisement. This was a huge turning point in the civil rights movement, because people knew there was racism and repression and violence in the South, but now it was elevated. And we see these dramatic images of people being squirted by these high-pressure hoses. A lot of people went to the hospital with broken ribs. Fred Shuttleworth went to the hospital because they broke, I think, a few ribs because of those hoses. And so it created a dramatic backlash, and thousands of people responded in solidarity protests all across the country, partly because of these images.
And thousands went to jail consecutively for many, many days. Huge amounts of sacrifice. And people were criticizing King at that time, saying, is this necessary? Because there were 4-year-olds that went to jail. I mean, 6-year-olds that went to jail. It was nuts. It was a huge protest.
So one of the concepts of nonviolence that is hard, and maybe you can go to the next slide, but is hard to talk about, is that we're creating a scenario a lot of times where people are volunteering to make deep sacrifices and to risk the possibility of repression. And White Walker, who was a famous strategist, who was called the architect of Birmingham, he knew that there was a very good chance in Birmingham that people were going to die. And obviously he didn't want that to happen, but he was prepared and actually challenging people to make those risks with the idea that if it did come, it was good for the movement. And when the dogs came out and the hoses came out, he was jumping up and down in happiness, because he knew that the public was going to side with the civil rights movement. That was a public relations disaster for the racist white Southerners. So the same thing you could see time and time again in the movement, that these trigger events happen because of police repression. In Occupy, this was one of the critical sparks of Occupy. this video went viral. They weren't getting much press before this, but the Occupy Wall Street had a video. Hundreds of thousands of people watched this video of basically the police with these nonviolent protesters spraying them directly in the eyes, trapping them in this sort of mesh, as you see, this red mesh, and spraying them in the eyes, and then watching them cry and in excruciating pain on the ground. This created tremendous amount, and it created the first sort of interest in the mainstream press for Occupy. It wasn't the only thing that started, but it certainly was a critical thing.
It was a big trigger, yeah. This was the last one, Paul.
And you know, the big one that I talk about is about political jiu-jitsu. That was really, in my own experience, is in the immigrant rights movement in 2006. We had 1.2 million people marching in the street, massive people. I mean, so miles and miles and miles of people on marches where you could get on top of buildings and look out and you couldn't see the end of the march. And then in 2007, literally 1 year after the historic marches, we had 2,000 people march. You could climb up to any tree and see the end of the march. Like you could probably see the end of the march by just jumping up and down. So it was really depressing for people. But the LAPD, for a variety of reasons, political reasons, they were very harsh to the immigrant rights movement. And because we were looking very small and we didn't have as much political power at that moment, they were really very oppositional towards us. So they told us to, they pushed us out of the park, and they fired tear gas and clubbed people and fired rubber bullets into the crowd to disperse them from MacArthur Park. And the crowd was filled with old people, with street merchants, with the press. Fox News had a press person and camera person that was clubbed by the media, by the police department. And what it did is it created tremendous backlash in the city for the immigrant rights movement. And it turned what was going to be a depressing march into a series of marches that became bigger and bigger and bigger. And it turned into a great event for our cause, which it created massive amounts, and this is what we're talking about, good polarization. It polarized the public towards us and against the LAPD and against what is considered to be anti-immigrant forces. So if there's a concept, that is reoccurring again and again and again throughout all these civil resistance struggles, which is if we are voluntarily choosing to bear the brunt, if they actually have to take the step forward and be blatant about their violence, instead of doing systemic violence under the table, they have to be public about their violence. That's one of the best things that dramatizes, as you can see in this picture, between who are the heroes and who are the enemies. There's very few things that create that much amount of public support.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk about the last part, team, which is, well, how do you measure good polarization? Because we're saying good actions equals good polarization. So we want to give you kind of a diagnostic tool for you to see it, which is based on the axis that we talked about, right? And team, first of all, there's plenty of actions. Actually, as we shared in webinar 2, Gene Sharp, a main theorist of nonviolent civil resistance, a couple of years ago kind of quantified all this and said that there was 198 methods of nonviolent action. Well, you can even say there's more, but I mean, he has a whole book on this, but there's plenty of actions. There's picketing, there's hunting officials, there's vigils, there's renouncing of honor, student strike, fast, so disobedience of legitimate laws, etc., etc. There's so many ways to do it. What we want to do right now is chunk them so you can see what are the categories or some of them, right? So let's go back to our spectrum. And I know, Paul, that you, based on Minnie's question, you wanted to add some stuff to this, right?
So I just wanted to say that Gene Sharp and Robert Helvey, who's the student of Gene Sharp, they wrote a lot about these methods. There's tons of them, and it gives you a sample of just hundreds and hundreds of different ways people have used nonviolence. And even everything that you see that a movement does, even like getting petitions, doing online email, alerts, things like that, are all fit within these different types of tactics. And he organizes them as methods of nonviolent protest and persuasion, methods of social non-cooperation, economic non-cooperation, political non-cooperation, and then he calls methods of nonviolent intervention, which is basically what he feels is higher levels of
disruption, pretty much.
Of disruption, yes. So he organizes those into those categories. But what we talk about really is that high disruption, high sacrifice are generally considered high risk, and with them there is a lot more polarization and potential for polarization, and low sacrifice, low disruption actions. And so that's how we categorize all these different tactics. And if you look on this, you can see all the actions that were listed in Gene Sharp can be put on this spectrum. And we're going to go over each different quadrant, because what we think is that each quadrant has strengths and weaknesses, okay, that your movement wants to use to create good polarization and to use the resources that your movement currently has. Because a lot of times you can't do high disruptive, high sacrifice actions because you don't have the resources. So you don't have the leaders, you don't have the ladder of engagement to be able to do that. So you want to go over the different
You want to go
types?
over the quadrants?
Yeah. Oh, no, the different types. We do
Okay, perfect. That's what I meant. Okay, go ahead, brother.
So first, there's small actions. Well, what are small actions? Small actions are like online petitions, delegations, picket lines. You know, these are vigils. Vigils are very, you know, just having somebody with a candlelight thing at a city hall, or at the side of a target, or at a symbolically important place like a park, around a cause like stopping the war or supporting immigrant rights. These small actions are low sacrifice, low disruptive, and they're good at building your base. It's really easy to ask somebody to do that. It's really easy to ask somebody to sign a petition online. And that lower rung of the ladder helps them participate, and then you get them to participate more after they sign a petition. You actually have their email, and you can communicate with them more and invite them to more things. So that's why it's called the ladder of engagement, is a lot of times people need to go up the ladder of engagement to develop their leadership. It's very hard to get press. It's very hard to polarize the public, because no one really cares that much if there's an online petition. No one cares if you have a little group of people delegating a politician. They probably won't even know about it, because it doesn't create high levels of sacrifice and disruption that create the press. So, but a lot of these small actions, and I want to say this, is it doesn't mean that you just do small actions or you just do high disruptive or high sacrificial actions. A lot of times you do a series of small actions, medium level actions, and highly sacrificial disruptive actions all at the same time, because you want to engage each level of people in your movement. Wherever your movement's at, you want people who are just passively or barely supporting you to sign a petition. You want people who are okay with doing a vigil to show up to the vigil. And you want people to do something that really dramatizes the issue, like get arrested. And each of those things helps, if you design the action right, each one can help build momentum, build the capacity for each one. So moments of the whirlwind and trigger events, we talked about this in webinar 2 about the cycle of momentum, is that most of the movements and the model that we're talking about, the hybrid model, really believes that there are climactic moments that really polarize the shit out of the public. And we know this. We know that 9/11 did so much in 1 week. The public opinion had changed more than in a decade around a whole series of issues, okay? If you think of Occupy, the Occupy movement, Occupy Wall Street, created more shifts in public opinion than 2 decades of a lot of small actions that didn't get nearly as much attention. and that didn't polarize around economic inequality, around a variety of different issues. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that they won everything, but it does mean that when you measure around good polarization, Occupy Wall Street was incredibly effective, and that had to do with hundreds of people getting arrested, thousands of people camping out, and the scale. Just every single city, every single major city in the United States of America had an occupation that I know of. Even small towns where my family was from in southern Wisconsin had a little occupation in the public park. So the scale was dramatic, and the level of sacrifice. People were getting arrested. I think there was a website that measured how many people were getting arrested in Occupy, and it was in the tens of thousands of people getting arrested in little actions here or there. So that creates a moment of the whirlwind. And what I say about the moment of the whirlwind is it's not just high sacrifice, high disruptive actions. It generally engages people at each level of engagement.
Level, yeah.
And but if you don't talk about high disruption, high sacrifice, you're really, the opportunities for trigger events and moments of the whirlwind to happen are actually very slim. It's very hard to create that. We had a whole list of moments of the whirlwind and trigger events that we went over in webinar 2 in the Indian independence movement, in Occupy, in the global justice movement around Seattle. And all of those events happened because of high levels of sacrifice or high levels of disruption. In Seattle, we had 40,000 people marching on the street, labor people and people in Africa that are talking about development policy of Jubilee 2000 in Africa and marching around. That didn't get the press as much as actually shutting down a huge portion of the city to try to stop the actual trade summit. That really galvanized the public because it was highly sacrificial. Lots of people went to jail. There was incredible amounts of beating, pepper spray, tear gas. It created massive amounts of repression, massive amounts of sacrifice, and massive amounts of disruption. And because of that, it created a whole whirlwind. It got front page New York Times. It ended the negotiations during that week. And so each one of those moments of the whirlwind happens when you create a trigger event. And there's a lot of factors in the 5 factors of polarization. If you do it right, occasionally you hit one out of the park, and it creates this huge whirlwind of activities happening all over the country, sometimes the world. This happened in Occupy at the height of Occupy Wall Street. It happened in the immigrant rights movement in 2006. It happened in the lunch counter sit-ins in the civil rights movement. It started in the lunch counter sit-ins with a few people doing. And I want to say this. In the South, sitting in breaking segregation laws, there were people who did that and were killed. Okay, they were killed. They were lynched. So, this is very high risk. People who were doing lunch counters, they ignored them the first couple of weeks. But after a little while, they knew and prepared themselves to be beaten by the Ku Klux Klan. So these people, this was an incredibly high-risk action, and it was somewhat disruptive. They were disrupting the downtown businesses, and from just a small group, it wasn't just a small group. After they did it, after a couple of weeks, they got more and more publicity, and it started being tens of thousands of people getting arrested and doing sit-ins all over the country, and that created a moment of the whirlwind that Martin Luther King called, it was the new phase of the civil rights movement. It was 1960, and he said, it was born out of the lunch counter sit-ins.
70,000 students did sit in the lunch counter. 70,000. Huge amount. They started small though. They went huge. Yeah.
You want to take the next? Oh.
No, I think
the anti-war movement. There was this protest right before in 2003, right before the invasion, which it was one of the largest day of world protest all over. There was major civil disobedience in some cities, like in San Francisco, but it was a lot that there was small levels of sacrifice, but high levels of disruption, because these were marches and stuff that were involving millions or 500,000 people in London and all these places. So even low levels of sacrifice, but with massive amounts of people, can create real disruption. and it could create real amounts of sacrifice if you talk about 20 million people marching all across the globe. But it's very hard to get there, to get that level of polarization with low levels of sacrifice. But this is an example of that happening. The New York Times said that it was one of the largest protests in world history, largest synchronized protest in world history. They said it was a new force in world history, that of public opinion. I don't know the exact quote, but something like that. And that was a whirlwind event.
Same thing with immigrant rights. I think, Paul, just because it's 8:22, I think you already shared some examples. I think people are getting, you also shared Occupy as well. But I think what it will be useful, Bell, if we can bring you back and we can hear, before we do any closing statements, before it's 8:30, I have 8 minutes. If people have any thoughts, questions, or comments, I mean, before you go, Bell, I just want to summarize, team, what we've been going through today. So first of all, we said that good actions equal good polarization, right? And we talked about what was good polarization, right? It's really getting the public to choose between your side or the opposition by doing these big actions that have 5 factors, right? I can put 10, but maybe it's just 5. 5 factors that make it cool, right? We said a good demand and the framing of the goal. That has to be clear, nice, and popular. 2, we said high levels of sacrifice and high levels of disruption. And then we also said sometimes we have to choose which way we go first, right? But the sacrifice really then goes into disruption and gets crazier, right? That was the second one. The third one, what was the third one, Paul? Shit, I forgot.
That's sympathetic and unsympathetic.
There you go. Sympathetic and unsympathetic. We went through people like Rosa Parks, who are very sympathetic to the Montgomery movement, or people that are highly unsympathetic to, like me, like Joe Arpaio, that I don't like him at all publicly. I'm saying in the webinar, I don't like you, Joe Arpaio. And fourth, we said some of the capacities of public relations, right? Having a relationship with the media, understanding even how to frame the issue in the correct way, right? And even your capacity to distribute a lot of your own media, which now with social media, it's actually becoming much easier. And we said the fifth factor is more intangible, which is sometimes it's even about the right moment, you know, like did the video make it in the right time? So I think we want to make sure the access serves as a point for you to see which action you want to do. But of course, we are definitely advocating for more sacrifice. We're definitely advocating for disruption at the right time, right, before you polarize in that regard. But we want to take a couple of minutes and see if there's any thoughts, questions, or comments, or things that you feel like, hey, that's useful, that's cool, or maybe this is confusing.
Great. So we're opening it up. Thoughts, questions, comments, things that were useful or interesting, things that were unclear.
What do you think, Belinda?
So, this is making me think a lot, and it's really, really, really interesting, like how all of these different factors come together, like where the public opinion is at, and understanding like how a highly disruptive or highly sacrificial kind of action will be received, and like figuring out just the timing of when it's appropriate. I wish I had like a magical computer app where I could input all the different like like components and be like, yes, time to escalate, or like, no, do a petition. But it's making me think a lot, and I think it's really interesting, but it's a lot to wrap my head around right now.
Well, the next webinar is prophetic promotion, and that is about whether or not to go big or to go home.
Excellent.
So that's a good transition right into the next webinar.
Series, for the next advanced
next series, yes, is prophetic promotion. So it really answers that question.
Can I add one more thing here, because I think this might help some of our viewers, our thousands of viewers online, is that, and we're not touching upon this a lot, but in the structured tradition, when you want to do high sacrifice or high disruption, usually the structured tradition doesn't want to do that for 2 reasons. One, because it views power, that power's at the top, and they say, well, why are we doing the civil disobedience if we're not going to meet with the target? So first of all, I think to understand is that the target here is the public. That's why sacrifice works with the public. So I want to make sure we highlight it again, because it is on a relationship with the public, to mobilize the public, not to affect Obama, not to affect some top target. That is not the point. right? Because you can do it and the Republicans can watch you die and they don't care. You know what I mean? So it's really in a relationship to the public. And I think the second thing here is that because it's decentralized, it actually, the people start seeing not as just one institution, but a whole segment of the population taking huge sacrifice on a cause that they care for. So I just want to put that out there because I think that is really a big deal as part of this, and that it can get confusing because I've seen so many people get into debates about, well, should we do civil disobedience or no? Should we do more radical tactics, as people like to frame them? And usually what happens is that it's because they don't understand that the target is actually the public. Because if you understand that, that gets to be much clearer. Paul?
Now I want to add something to that. It's not just that the target is the public. That's one thing. But the second thing is that a lot of union structures or even IAF or the structured tradition, they don't have the type of organization that could absorb public support. So who can, they're like, yeah, okay, great, you create a lot of public support, but we just had all these workers that went on strike and they were repressed and our organization is in shambles and we have all this public support, but who cares? Our organization can't handle it. We don't have the resources. And so we didn't get more members. And in some ways they're right. Like, we did this huge thing in 2006 and we didn't have the capacity to absorb all that public support. But what we're talking about in our model is that we have to build the infrastructure to be able to absorb public support. So that's a different question. We're assuming that we have a movement that's decentralized, that's designed to be able to absorb the momentum. And what Gandhi talked about this is it's like starting a prairie fire. We want to really open up the can of whoop ass, and we want it to spread in momentum. For us, that's really important because the movement, these are momentum-driven organizations, okay? These are, we live and die off of momentum. We have to create that. And what creates momentum is high disruption and high sacrifice. The structured-based organizations, they don't live off of momentum. Momentum to them is just leverage on the target.
Cool. I actually have one question that came up for me, which is that, like, since it's like, there's a lot of like really nuanced things that go into making a decision of like what kind of action to do at what time and when it's appropriate to like escalate or do something that's like maybe less disruption. Like how could you facilitate people to make those decisions in an intelligent way in the context of a decentralized campaign where the grand strategy is front loaded and you already have autonomous teams that are on the ground running?
Well, I think a lot of that is in the next advanced series, is in prophetic promotion. But I think that the question there is in civil resistance trainings that are done by Canvas or some experts at the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, some academics, they talk about this as tactical sequencing, okay? And when we're talking about it as the grand strategy too, for us, the grand strategy involves creating moments of the whirlwind and trigger events. That is part of our grand strategy. We have to get there. And if you build it, they will come. You have to have a vision of a huge, big-ass party, because no one's gonna come to your little party. They want to come to a big party, right? So you have to have it. But do you really have the resources to pull off a big party? So there's a real balance between being prophetic and having faith that you can do something big enough to create massive amounts of polarization and allow everyone to show up to your party because they want to. But you also have to weigh whether or not you can actually pull it off.
Can I add something to this, Paul?
Yes.
Is that I feel like, I don't know, I feel there's a rule in my heart about this, which is that if you can escalate, escalate.
Yes.
Because most people, I think, they trip over escalation. Like, people actually have the resources, and it's so crazy because here's where creativity comes from and resourcefulness. Like, you can look at the 99 Rights action that Paul was talking about Kai getting arrested at the Supreme Court, right? I mean, think about it. One person got arrested for 1 day, and then of course guy had to come back to the seat to go through that, right? It was took risk, but it wasn't that huge amount of risk. It wasn't hundreds of people, but then they got a lot of media. So I think that to me it's a question, if you can escalate, escalate. But the second thing that I would have is, before you escalate, have the resources to absorb the momentum. Because like I see so many, like for example, the unions can escalate dramatically if they would want to. Like organizations that are large organizations, progressive organizations can escalate. They can. They have the resources. They have these people, but they don't do it. And I think my question is, I think our second part of our theory is escalation, right? And our third one is absorption. So I would say have the tools to absorb, which is all the online stuff and the ladder of engagement. But if you can escalate, escalate. It's going to help you out. Do it. Don't be afraid of it. Think about it. It's not an easy step, but do it. It's going to help you much more than not escalating. Not escalating deflates your movement. So I just want to share that.
I couldn't agree with you more, Carlos. Like, when I consult with labor unions and stuff, the real question isn't that they don't have capacity. They almost always have capacity. They have a tremendous network of really incredibly committed leadership. If they wanted to, they could get hundreds of people to go on hunger strike for weeks on end if they wanted to. They have the resources to do it. Really, what's missing is the faith and the belief in escalation and the capacity to absorb it, what Carlos was saying.
And Paul,
so,
can I just add to what you're bringing here? Yes. Is that they're also not just missing the faith and the peace, but they're missing the science of escalation, which is what we're offering in this webinar, which is that, for example, unions spend all this amount of money given, and I love unions, but let me just put it out there. They give tons of amount of money to candidates in politics. They do huge GOTV operations. And then if you measure what has happened in the last 10 years, what have been the actual changes that they got, and you can say, like, did you really get that much from the investment you made? But they have a faith and actually a belief scientifically that the elections will give them results. Well, what we're showing them here is that there's a scientific proof that this escalation, which is manifested through sacrifice and disruption, actually works. And if you have absorption, you can digest and get stronger. So that's why we're also trying to put this not just in faith and belief, but actually reading what Gandhi and Chavez were saying, which they were not just trying to motivate their people, they were putting their scientific understanding out there. Mm-hmm. To say that sacrifice generates more momentum, which generates more popular support.
Preach, brother. That is awesome.
Yeah.
Woo!
I know. I just got some sugar, so I was just excited. So.
Yes, that was good.
We're sponsored by Trident White.
Yeah. And coffee. And coffee.
And coffee.
And
coffee.
tea.
I drink buddy coffee, vanilla latte.
You're so funny, Paul.
Belle, any thoughts, questions from anybody over there?
No, we haven't.
People, they're probably just like.
Any questions?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah. Yeah, this one's very heady. There's a lot to process. We haven't gotten any questions.
Okay. Well, team, is 8:34. Any last messages that Belle, Paul want to say? This is our last webinar of our advanced series.
I just want to say this. I want to say this. When I am able to predict polarization, and I go into consulting jobs with other people, and I could say, I think this is good for you if you polarize around this, and I can prove and I can predict this. People love that. They love it. And through polling, if you have this theory and then you have polling that backs it up, and the polling really does back it up scientifically, you can see how it creates polarization and who is polarized to do what. And you can actually, nowadays, there's micro-polling and stuff that actually pulls around why people move, why people are motivated to choose your side. And all of that really backs up the theory. There still needs to be a lot of scientific study and political, like Erica Chenoweth-like data collection around this to show, just to have immense amounts of data to back it up. But in my experience, I haven't really found an exception to it. This theory really explains pretty much why the public sides with you or doesn't.
Thank you, Paul. Belle, any last closing comments just on our series? Anything you want to say to the participants? we won't be back on the air for months now at this point.
I don't know. I've enjoyed this series a lot because I was so excited, Paul, when I met you and you were talking about structure and momentum and moments of the whirlwind, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I want to learn how to make this happen on purpose. This is so cool. And then it's just been really, really gratifying because I'm seeing, us learn so much together. With Carlos's help in systematizing all of your great ideas, Paul. And then, but the coolest thing for me has been, the enthusiasm that we've been met by from people who participated and people who, watch the stuff on YouTube later. Like I know my friends from NYU Divest are currently strategizing for next year since summer just started, and they watched our team structure webinar and they're trying to think about how to go decentralized, and it's really exciting. And my friend like Casey was like tweeting at me and was just like, this is so awesome, thank you guys for doing this and making it accessible. So those are my closing thoughts. I just have a lot of warm fuzzies because I think this matters, and it warms my heart that we get to do this together and that people like it. And Leland says, woo, yeah.
I just want to say I couldn't do it without Carlos. I'm a Brady weird dude. Carlos makes me accessible to the public.
Yes.
I bring popular support to Paul.
I need my cycle of Paul momentum would not be able to be completed without Carlos.
Oh, you're the sweetest.
Leland is laughing.
Yes, he's the absorption part of the. Well, no, he's probably the popular support part, active popular support part of this cycle. I'm good at escalating. There's no doubt about that. It's not always good
yes, you are.
It's towards me. Sometimes it's not towards me.
I'm very
just
grateful
ask
for
my
both of
girlfriend.
you.
She can tell you about that.
Let's pull Paul's girlfriend about the popular support and escalation.
That I polarize people against me all the time.
Oh my goodness.
Well, team, I wanted to say, first of all, I think to all of our participants, thank you for joining us. We love you, and your feedback has been wonderful to all of us. And thank you, Paul, for being awesome and sharing all this stuff with us and letting me sometimes tell you, we gotta do less, and we get into fights and stuff. But thank you so much. I learned so much from you this whole time. I learned tons. This was one of my best movement educations, really, I think, in my many years of organizing. And Belinda, thank you for you being our feedback person, really keeping us grounded, keeping us organized. And we're doing this for no money. We're doing this because we love people and we want to see the world be a better place. As fuzzy as that sounds, that's what we want.
It's true.
But thank you all. Thank you all so much.
We might in September we might get back on with another series of advanced webinars.
Woo. Okay. Bye everybody.
Bye all.
Thanks.